There are phrases that feel less like words and more like a backstage pass, and sex, drugs, rock and roll is one of them. It hums with distortion, sweat, neon lights, and the low thud of a bass line felt in the chest before it's heard. For decades, this phrase has framed the public imagination of rock culture, shaping how fans understand the lives lived just beyond the stage lights. What makes sex, drugs, and rock and roll endure isn't shock value, it's honesty. It's the refusal to polish the rough edges, and behind every sold out arena and smashed guitar lived nights that blurred together, filled with adrenaline, indulgence, and an unspoken belief that tomorrow could wait. This is why the best in rock and roll book doesn't sanitize. It documents the chaos with clarity, capturing what it meant to live inside the noise rather than merely listening from the crowd. Once the amps cooled and the crowds spilled into the streets, the real theater often began, and that was in hotel hallways, turned into social crossroads. Dressing rooms became private worlds. Groupies were in caricatures. They were part of the ecosystem, drawn to the creativity of performers who seemed to live outside ordinary rules. Within sex, drugs, and rock and roll, intimacy wasn't scheduled. It happened in fragments between sound checks and sunrise. Sex parties were spoken about in hushed tones later, less for scandal and more for disbelief that such nights could exist at all. They weren't choreographed fantasies, but spontaneous collusions of people chasing sensation and connection in a life that moved too fast for reflection. Many rock and roll books revisit these scenes not to glorify them, but to explain the emotional velocity of that era. The closeness, the excess, the hunger to feel something real before the next city blurred into view. Drugs were never just props in sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They were tools, crutches, and sometimes traps. From stimulants that kept bodies upright throughout endless tours to substances used to quiet the noise after the show, chemicals played different roles on different nights. A serious rock and roll memoir's approach doesn't rely on shock. It contextualizes. It explains why certain drugs circulated backstage and why others followed musicians home. Some were about stamina, others were about silence. Many were about surviving an environment where normal rhythms of sleep, privacy, and grounding barely existed. In the most compelling rock and roll book, these moments are described with reflection rather than bragging. The honesty lands harder when the narrator understands what those choices cost. Strip everything else away, and sex, drugs, rock and roll always comes back to the music. The grind of rehearsal, the violence of volume, the precision hidden inside apparent chaos. Rock wasn't just a soundtrack to its excess, it was the reason excess gathered in the first place. The best rock and roll books never lose sight of this. They describe how songs were born in exhaustion, how riffs emerged after nights that ran too long, how the roar of a crowd could feel like absolution. Without the music, the rest collapses into an empty spectacle. Many rock and roll memoirs revealed that what musicians chased wasn't pleasure alone. It was transcendence, a moment on stage where everything aligned and the world briefly made sense. Modern audiences aren't naive. They don't need fairy tales. They want perspective. That's why sex, drugs, and rock and roll still sells books, fills documentaries, and fuels conversations. Readers want to know how it really felt to live without a safety net. A well-written rock and roll book doesn't just recount wild nights. It connects them to the cost of living loud, the relationship strained, the bodies worn down, the strange grief that followed the applause. The strongest rock and roll memoirs understand that legacy matters more than legend. They don't deny the excess. They frame it as part of a larger human story about ambition, appetite, and art. Long after the lights go dark, sex, drugs, and rock and roll remains shorthand for a moment in cultural history when restraint felt optional and volume felt necessary. It survives because it was real, messy, and unscripted. Every meaningful rock and roll book's entry into the world respects that tension. The thrill and the fallout, the freedom and the price. It's not nostalgia, it's documentation. As long as people want to understand how music once rewired the rules of living, Sex, drugs, and rock and roll will keep echoing loud and unapologetic.